Dr. Harrison's hands trembled as he stared at the lab results, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips, the morning light casting long shadows across Madison Thompson's medical file. In 30 years of practice, he had never encountered anything like this. What he expected to find was a simple ear infection. What stared back at him from the genetic analysis was a death sentence wrapped in a 16-year-old girl's DNA. The nurse behind him gasped audibly, her clipboard clattering to the sterile hospital floor as she read over his shoulder. Another colleague rushed to steady her, their faces draining of color in perfect synchronization. Through the observation window, Madison sat laughing with her stepmother, Sarah, completely unaware that her auburn hair, always worn strategically over her ears, had been hiding far more than teenage insecurity. The same mysterious swelling that had claimed her biological mother's life was now blooming behind her ear like a ticking time bomb. "Get the family in here immediately," Dr. Harrison whispered, his voice barely audible above the thundering of his own heartbeat. "How do you tell a child she's inherited her mother's killer? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story." 6 months earlier, the Thompson family home on Maple Street embodied the quiet struggles of small-town America. The 2-story house, with its peeling white paint and sagging front porch, stood as a testament to dreams deferred but not abandoned. Inside, the aroma of Sarah's homemade apple pie mingled with the lingering scent of Bobby's aftershave as he prepared for another double shift at the factory. Madison Rose Thompson sat at her bedroom vanity, carefully arranging her long auburn hair to cascade over both ears, a ritual she'd perfected over the past year. At 16, she was Millbrook High's unlikely honor roll student, the girl who tutored struggling classmates while harboring her own impossible dream of attending Ohio State's pre-med program. The acceptance letter would mean nothing without the $40,000 annual tuition her family could never afford. Downstairs, Sarah Beth Parker Thompson wiped flour from her apron and glanced at the kitchen clock. In 2 hours, she'd begin her evening shift at Murphy's Diner, serving coffee and consolation to neighbors who, like her, were one paycheck away from disaster. She'd married Bobby 8 years ago when Madison was just 8, stepping into a ready-made family haunted by the ghost of Elizabeth Thompson, a woman whose medical history remained locked away in Bobby's grief. Bobby himself embodied the stoic strength of Midwest men shouldering factory work that had grown increasingly scarce since the recession. His calloused hands bore testament to 18-hour days, yet he never complained. The framed photo of Elizabeth on his nightstand served as both comfort and torment, a reminder of the love he'd lost and the fear that history might repeat itself. In the small apartment above the garage, 73-year-old Eleanor "Nana" Thompson hummed gospel hymns while mending clothes by lamplight. Her Social Security check barely covered medications, but she'd rather starve than burden her son's family. She remembered things others had forgotten, like Elizabeth's mysterious episodes that doctors had dismissed as anxiety, and the way Madison sometimes touched her ear the same way her mother once had. The Thompson family dinner table, scarred by years of homework sessions and heart-to-heart conversations, would soon become the epicenter of their greatest crisis. Sarah's carefully budgeted meals stretched hamburger into 3 different dinners, while Madison's academic achievements decorated the refrigerator like medals of hope in a house where hope was rationed as carefully as groceries. Millbrook itself seemed frozen in time, a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where Murphy's Diner served as unofficial city hall, and where medical emergencies meant choosing between rent and prescriptions. The local factory's reduced hours had touched every family, creating a community bound together by shared struggle and stubborn pride. None of them knew that Madison's carefully concealed ear had begun to swell, or that Sarah had noticed her stepdaughter's increasingly frequent headaches. None of them suspected that the small bump Madison attributed to a pimple would soon force them to confront secrets buried with Elizabeth Thompson, secrets that would either destroy their family or forge them into something stronger than blood alone could create. October arrived in Millbrook with the cruel beauty of autumn, painting the Thompsons' maple trees in shades of gold that reminded Sarah of better times. Madison stood before her bedroom mirror, preparing for homecoming week, when her fingers discovered something that would change everything. Behind her right ear, hidden beneath the curtain of auburn hair she'd grown longer each year, was a small, firm bump no bigger than a marble. "Probably just a pimple," she whispered to her reflection, but something cold settled in her stomach. The bump felt different, harder, more persistent than any blemish she'd ever had. She adjusted her hair carefully, ensuring the area remained completely hidden, and went downstairs to join her family for dinner. Sarah noticed immediately how Madison favored her left side, unconsciously tilting away from the table's overhead light. As a waitress, Sarah had developed an eye for people trying to hide pain, the way they moved, the subtle winces they thought no one would catch. When Madison reached for the salt shaker, Sarah glimpsed her stepdaughter's fingers briefly touching her ear before quickly pulling her hair forward. "Honey, you feeling all right?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the gentle concern that had taken 8 years to perfect. "You look a little pale." Madison's response came too quickly, too brightly. "I'm fine, just tired from studying." But Sarah had raised enough teenagers at the diner, watching over the children of single mothers working double shifts, to recognize the particular strain in Madison's voice, the sound of someone carrying a secret too heavy for their years. Bobby, exhausted from another 14-hour shift, barely looked up from his meatloaf. The factory had announced more layoffs, and he'd volunteered for every available overtime hour, desperate to maintain the illusion of financial stability. He missed the exchange between his wife and daughter entirely, his mind calculating bills and wondering how long their savings would last if his hours got cut again. The first week passed with Madison's condition worsening in small, terrifying increments. The bump grew from marble-sized to grape-sized, becoming tender to the touch. She began sleeping exclusively on her left side, positioning her pillow to avoid any pressure on the affected area. Her grades, usually impeccable, showed the first signs of decline as concentration became increasingly difficult. Nana Thompson, with the sharp eyes of someone who'd raised 5 children and buried 2, noticed what the others missed. During their usual Sunday dinner, she watched Madison push food around her plate, observed the way her granddaughter kept touching her neck, and remembered another young woman who'd made similar gestures decades ago. "Child, you look peaked," Nana said, her southern drawl still strong after 40 years in Ohio. "Your mama used to get that same hollow look around your age." The mention of Elizabeth caused Bobby to stiffen, his fork suspended midway to his mouth. Madison's eyes darted between her father and grandmother, sensing undercurrents she couldn't quite grasp. Sarah felt the familiar pang of being an outsider to the Thompson family history, the stories that stopped whenever she entered a room. By the 3rd week of October, the pain had become Madison's constant companion. She found herself holding her breath during algebra class, gripping her pencil until her knuckles went white whenever someone spoke too loudly. Her friend Jessica noticed she'd stopped participating in their usual lunch table gossip, preferring to sit quietly with her hair forming a protective curtain around her face. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when Madison thought she was alone in the house. Sarah had returned early from the diner after a customer complained about slow service, the first negative feedback she'd received in 3 years. She climbed the stairs quietly, planning to apologize to Madison for snapping about unmade beds that morning when she heard something that made her freeze on the landing. Madison was crying, not the dramatic tears of teenage heartbreak, but the desperate, muffled sobs of someone in genuine distress. Through the crack in the bedroom door, Sarah could see her stepdaughter hunched over her laptop, one hand pressed against her ear, while the other scrolled frantically through medical websites. Ear infection symptoms, Sarah read silently from the screen's reflection in the window. When to see a doctor. Signs of serious complications. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. This wasn't teenage drama or academic stress. Madison was in real pain, had been suffering for weeks, and was too afraid or too proud to ask for help. Sarah thought of her own mother, who died of treatable pneumonia because she couldn't afford a doctor visit, and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. That night, after Bobby fell asleep to the drone of late-night television, Sarah knocked softly on Madison's door. The conversation that followed would later be remembered as the moment their relationship shifted from polite coexistence to something approaching genuine trust. Two women, recognizing their shared determination to protect what mattered most, even when they weren't entirely sure they had the strength to do it. The November wind rattled the Thompson house like a harbinger of the storm brewing within its walls. Madison sat at the kitchen table, her Thanksgiving homework spread before her, but the words on the page blurred together as another wave of pain crashed behind her ear. The swelling had grown impossible to hide, creating a visible distortion that no amount of carefully arranged hair could conceal. Sarah entered the kitchen carrying a basket of laundry, her waitress uniform still smelling of coffee and cigarette smoke from the diner's late shift. She stopped mid-step when she saw Madison's reflection in the kitchen window, the unmistakable bulge behind her right ear catching the afternoon light like a beacon of distress. "Madison Rose Thompson, we need to talk." The use of her full name made Madison's stomach clench. She'd heard that tone before, usually reserved for serious infractions or life-changing conversations. Her hand instinctively moved to cover her ear, but Sarah was already crossing the room, her expression shifting from concern to barely contained panic. "How long?" Sarah's voice was steady, but Madison could see her stepmother's hands trembling as she set down the laundry basket. "It's nothing, really. Just don't you dare lie to me." The sharpness in Sarah's voice surprised them both. "I've watched you suffer for weeks. I've seen you holding your head during homework, sleeping on one side, touching that spot when you think nobody's looking. How long, Madison?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Madison felt tears threatening, the careful composure she'd maintained for months finally cracking under the weight of Sarah's direct gaze. "Since October. But it's probably just—" "Since October?" Sarah's voice rose an octave. "Jesus Christ, Madison, that's over a month!" The sound of Bobby's work boots on the front porch interrupted them. He entered through the kitchen door, his face gray with exhaustion, lunch pail in one hand and a stack of bills in the other. The scene before him, Sarah standing rigid with worry, Madison hunched defensively at the table, immediately set him on edge. "What's going on?" Sarah turned to face her husband, and Madison saw something she'd never witnessed before. Sarah Parker Thompson, angry, not frustrated or disappointed, but genuinely, righteously furious in the way only mothers could be when their children were threatened. "Your daughter has been hiding a medical condition for over a month, and we're taking her to see a doctor tonight." Bobby's eyes moved between his wife and daughter, processing the information with the methodical slowness of a man accustomed to bad news. "What kind of medical condition?" Madison finally lifted her head, pushing her hair back to reveal the swelling that had become her constant companion. Bobby's reaction was immediate and visceral, a sharp intake of breath followed by a stumbling step backward as if he'd been physically struck. "Oh, God! Oh, sweet Jesus, no!" The terror in her father's voice sent ice through Madison's veins. This wasn't the reaction of a parent concerned about a routine medical issue. This was recognition, and with it came a fear so profound it transformed Bobby's face into that of a much older man. "Bobby, what is it?" Sarah's anger began shifting toward confusion. "What aren't you telling us?" But Bobby had gone pale, one hand gripping the kitchen counter for support. His lunch pail clattered to the floor, spilling thermos coffee across the linoleum. "We can't afford another doctor visit this month," he whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. "The car repair, the insurance deductible from when you cut your hand. To hell with the money." Sarah's words rang through the kitchen like gunshots. "Look at her, Bobby." "Really look at your daughter." The sound of Nana's walker tapping against the hardwood floor announced her arrival from the adjoining living room. At 73, Eleanor Thompson still possessed the keen instincts that had guided her through 5 decades of motherhood, and the tension radiating from the kitchen had drawn her like a magnet. "What's all this commotion about?" Her eyes immediately found Madison's exposed ear, and her weathered face went through the same transformation Bobby's had. Recognition followed by unmistakable dread. "Lord have mercy." "Nana?" Madison's voice was small, frightened by the adult terror surrounding her. "What's wrong with me?" The old woman's eyes moved between her son and granddaughter, decades of family secrets weighing heavy in the silence. "Bobby, you gotta tell them. You can't keep carrying Elizabeth's ghost like this." "Tell us what?" Sarah's patience finally shattered. "What the hell is everyone talking about?" "What ghosts?" Bobby sank into a kitchen chair as if his legs could no longer support him. When he spoke, his voice carried the hollow tone of a man revisiting his worst nightmare. "Elizabeth had episodes. Before Madison was born, after. The doctors never could figure them out. Swelling, pain, infections that wouldn't respond to antibiotics. Madison felt the world tilting around her. Mom was sick? She died of complications," Bobby continued, each word seeming to cost him tremendous effort. "The doctors said it was some kind of immune system problem, but they never gave it a name, never found a cure." Sarah's anger dissolved into something approaching horror as the implications settled over her. "You think Madison has the same thing?" "I pray to God she doesn't." Bobby's voice broke entirely. "But the swelling, the location, it's exactly how Elizabeth started." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Madison stared at her family, the people who were supposed to protect her from life's cruelties, and saw only fear reflecting back at her. "We're going to the emergency room," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. "Right now. And I don't care if we have to mortgage this house to pay for it." For the first time in months, Madison felt something other than physical pain. As terrifying as her father's revelations were, Sarah's fierce protectiveness wrapped around her like armor. Whatever was wrong with her ear, whatever connection it might have to her mother's death, she wouldn't face it alone. The drive to Millbrook General would take 20 minutes through the November darkness, but Madison sensed they were traveling toward something that would change their family forever. The fluorescent lights of Millbrook General's emergency room cast everything in harsh, unforgiving white as the Thompson family huddled together in plastic chairs that seemed designed for maximum discomfort. Madison pressed an ice pack against her ear while Sarah filled out insurance forms with the grim determination of someone who knew every line represented potential financial ruin. Dr. Patricia Williams, the attending physician, emerged from behind curtain 3 with the kind of measured expression that made Bobby's stomach clench. At 55, she'd seen enough medical mysteries in rural Ohio to know when something required more expertise than Millbrook General could provide. "The swelling is significant," she told the family, her voice carefully neutral. "I'm referring you to Dr. Michael Harrison at Columbus Children's Hospital. He's one of the region's leading specialists in complex ear, nose, and throat conditions." Sarah's pen stopped mid-signature on the insurance paperwork. "Children's Hospital. That's 2 hours away. We don't have—" She caught herself before finishing the sentence, but everyone understood. They didn't have the gas money for multiple trips to Columbus, let alone the resources for specialized treatment. "I understand the financial concerns," Dr. Williams said gently, "but Madison's presentation is unusual enough that I feel obligated to recommend the best possible care. Dr. Harrison has seen cases like this before." The phrase, "cases like this," hung in the air like a threat. Bobby found himself remembering Elizabeth's final weeks when doctors had used similar language, vague, ominous references to complexity and rarity that ultimately meant they were guessing. The drive home from the hospital passed in loaded silence, each family member lost in private fears. Madison stared out the passenger window at the familiar streets of Millbrook, wondering if her childhood was ending in the space between one doctor's appointment and the next. Sarah gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, mentally calculating the cost of missing work for medical appointments. Bobby sat in the back seat, wrestling with memories he'd spent 8 years trying to bury. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing snow that buried Millbrook under 6 inches of complications. The appointment with Dr. Harrison had been scheduled for the week before Christmas, but insurance pre-authorization delayed everything until after New Year's. Madison's condition worsened steadily. The swelling increased, accompanied by a persistent drainage that stained her pillowcases and forced her to change her hair routine entirely. School became a minefield of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Her friend Jessica finally cornered her in the girls' bathroom, demanding to know why Madison had been avoiding everyone for weeks. The truth spilled out in broken fragments. The pain, the fear, the family secrets she was only beginning to understand. "You should have told someone sooner," Jessica said, her usual teenage drama replaced by genuine concern. "My mom says hiding medical stuff just makes it worse." But Madison couldn't explain the complicated web of shame and financial anxiety that had kept her silent. How do you tell your friends that your family debates whether to buy groceries or pay for doctor visits? How do you admit that seeking help feels like admitting defeat? At home, the atmosphere grew increasingly strained. Sarah had taken a third job catering weekend parties, leaving before dawn and returning after midnight with hands that smelled of other people's celebrations. Bobby picked up every available overtime shift, but the factory's reduced operations meant competition for extra hours was fierce. Even Nana contributed her meager Social Security check, though the gesture created more guilt than relief. The weight of their sacrifice wasn't lost on Madison. She began experiencing a different kind of pain, the crushing awareness that her medical needs were slowly destroying her family's stability. Late at night, she researched her symptoms online, reading medical journals she barely understood, searching for some explanation that wouldn't require expensive specialist care. Sarah discovered these nocturnal research sessions during one of her rare early evenings home. She found Madison hunched over her laptop at 2 a.m., surrounded by printouts of medical articles about autoimmune conditions, genetic disorders, and treatment options that cost more than their annual household income. "Honey, what are you doing?" Madison looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for her 16 years. "Trying to figure out what's wrong with me so we don't have to bankrupt the family finding out." The statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. She sat down on Madison's bed, suddenly understanding the impossible burden her stepdaughter had been carrying alone. Madison rose. "You listen to me. Your health is worth more than any amount of money." "But what if the treatments cost $50,000? $100,000? Madison's voice cracked. "I've seen what medical bills can do to families. The Hendersons lost their house when Mr. Henderson had his heart attack. The Millers filed bankruptcy after Emma's leukemia treatment." Sarah felt tears threatening as she realized how thoroughly Madison had absorbed the harsh realities of American healthcare. At 16, she was making calculations that no teenager should have to consider, weighing her own survival against her family's financial destruction. "We'll figure it out," Sarah promised, though she had no idea how. "That's what families do. We figure it out together." But privately, Sarah lay awake each night doing her own calculations. Their savings account held $2,847, enough to cover maybe one specialist appointment without insurance approval. Their credit cards were nearly maxed from previous medical expenses and car repairs. The house, their only real asset, still carried a mortgage that would take another 15 years to pay off. The situation reached a breaking point in early January when Madison collapsed during chemistry class. The school nurse called an ambulance, and Sarah raced from Murphy's Diner still wearing her coffee-stained apron and hairnet. She arrived at Millbrook General to find Madison conscious but running a fever of 103 degrees. "The infection has spread," Dr. Williams explained, her earlier diplomatic tone replaced by urgency. "We can treat the immediate symptoms, but she needs to see Dr. Harrison immediately. This can't wait for insurance approval." Sarah looked at her stepdaughter lying pale and small in the hospital bed, IV antibiotics dripping steadily into her arm. The financial implications seemed irrelevant compared to the possibility of losing Madison entirely. "Call Dr. Harrison. Make the appointment for tomorrow if possible." Bobby arrived at the hospital still wearing his factory uniform, having left work mid-shift when Sarah's panicked call reached him. The three of them spent the night in Madison's room, taking turns dozing in the uncomfortable visitor chair while machines monitored her vital signs. At 3 a.m., Madison woke to find Sarah sitting vigil beside her bed. "I'm scared," she whispered, the first time she'd admitted her fear aloud. Sarah took her hand, careful to avoid the IV line. "I know, honey, but you're not facing this alone. Whatever happens, we're in this together. What if I die like my mom did?" The question hung in the darkness between them, too important for easy reassurance. Sarah chose honesty over comfort. "I don't know what's going to happen, but I know your mom fought as hard as she could, and we're going to fight just as hard for you. Medicine is better now than it was 16 years ago. We have options she didn't have." Madison squeezed Sarah's hand, drawing strength from her stepmother's unwavering presence. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "Never," Sarah replied firmly. "You're my daughter in every way that matters, and daughters don't give up on their mothers either." The next morning brought Dr. Harrison's call personally, a rarity that immediately put the family on edge. He'd reviewed Madison's emergency room records and wanted to see her that afternoon. No insurance pre-authorization required. His voice carried an urgency that made Sarah's hand shake as she wrote down the appointment details. The drive to Columbus Children's Hospital took place during the worst snowstorm of the winter, forcing Bobby to grip the steering wheel with white knuckles while Madison dozed fitfully in the passenger seat. Sarah sat in the back, silently promising any listening deity that she'd sacrifice anything, her own health, their house, their future financial security, if Madison could just be okay. They arrived at the hospital 2 hours late, apologizing profusely for the weather delays. Dr. Harrison, a distinguished man in his early 60s with kind eyes and steady hands, waved away their concerns. "Weather waits for no one in Ohio," he said with a smile that immediately put Madison at ease. The examination that followed was more thorough than anything they'd experienced at Millbrook General. Dr. Harrison spent 45 minutes examining Madison's ear with various instruments, asking detailed questions about her symptoms, her family history, and Elizabeth's medical records, which Bobby had finally retrieved from their storage box in the basement. When he finished, Dr. Harrison's expression had shifted from professional interest to something approaching excitement, not the gleeful kind, but the focused intensity of a puzzle solver who'd found a crucial piece. "I need to run some very specific tests," he announced. "Blood work, imaging studies, and genetic screening. It's going to take several days to get results, but I have a strong suspicion about what we're dealing with. Is it the same thing that killed my wife? Bobby's voice was barely above a whisper. Dr. Harrison paused thoughtfully before answering. Potentially related, yes. But Mr. Thompson, medicine has advanced considerably in the past 16 years. What might have been untreatable in 2008 could be very manageable today. For the first time in months, Madison felt something other than fear or pain. She felt hope, tentative and fragile, but real nonetheless. Whatever was wrong with her, whatever connection it had to her mother's death, she was facing it with better weapons than Elizabeth had possessed. The family left Columbus Children's Hospital with a schedule of follow-up appointments, a stack of requisition forms for various tests, and the first genuine optimism they'd experienced since this nightmare began. The drive home took place through clearing skies, as if the weather itself was offering encouragement. That evening, gathered around their scarred kitchen table for the first family dinner in weeks, Madison made an announcement that surprised everyone, including herself. "I want to study medicine," she said quietly. "Whatever happens with my own treatment, I want to help other families going through this. No one should have to choose between their health and their financial survival." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Then that's what you'll do. We'll find a way to make it happen." Bobby nodded, his throat too tight for words. For the first time since Elizabeth's death, the future held possibilities beyond mere survival. February descended on Millbrook like a predator, bringing with it the kind of bone-deep cold that made every breath visible and every step treacherous. Madison sat in the passenger seat of their 10-year-old Honda, watching her breath fog the window as they made their third trip to Columbus Children's Hospital in 2 weeks. The stack of test results in Dr. Harrison's office had grown thicker with each visit, but his expressions had grown more grave. The waiting room buzzed with the particular tension that accompanied life-changing news. Sarah gripped Bobby's hand so tightly that his wedding ring left marks on her palm, while Madison stared at a children's mural depicting cartoon animals that seemed to mock the severity of their situation. When Dr. Harrison finally called them into his office, his usual warm smile was notably absent. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing to the chairs arranged in a semicircle before his desk. The formal arrangement immediately put the family on edge. This wasn't going to be a casual consultation. Dr. Harrison opened Madison's file, revealing laboratory reports covered in medical terminology that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. "The genetic testing has given us definitive answers," he began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering devastating news. "Madison has a rare autoimmune condition called familial adenomatous polyposis with lymphatic involvement. It's an inherited disorder that affects approximately 1 in 10,000 people." Bobby's face went ashen. "Is that what Elizabeth had?" "Based on the medical records you provided and the symptoms you've described, yes. Your late wife almost certainly had the same condition, though it went undiagnosed." Dr. Harrison's voice softened slightly. "In 2008, we simply didn't have the genetic testing capabilities we have today." Sarah felt the world shifting beneath her feet. "What does this mean for Madison? What's the prognosis?" The silence that followed stretched like a chasm. Dr. Harrison removed his glasses and cleaned them methodically, a gesture that seemed designed to buy time before delivering an unbearable truth. "Without treatment, this condition is progressive and ultimately fatal. The lymphatic involvement creates a cascade of complications that typically become life-threatening within 2 to 3 years of onset." Madison's voice emerged as barely a whisper. "I'm going to die?" "Not if I have anything to say about it." Dr. Harrison replaced his glasses and leaned forward, his tone shifting from clinical to determined. "The good news, and there is good news, is that we now have treatment options that simply didn't exist when your mother was sick. There's an experimental therapy showing remarkable success rates, particularly when caught as early as yours has been. Bobby found his voice, though it cracked with emotion. What kind of treatment? What are we talking about? Dr. Harrison pulled out another folder, this one containing information about clinical trials and treatment protocols. It's called targeted immunotherapy. Essentially, we reprogram Madison's immune system to stop attacking her own tissue. The success rate in early-stage patients is approximately 95%. For a moment, hope bloomed in the room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Then, Sarah asked the question that had been haunting their sleepless nights. What does it cost? The pause that followed was answer enough. Dr. Harrison's expression shifted to one of deep regret. The treatment protocol runs approximately $180,000 over 18 months. Most insurance companies classify it as experimental, which means coverage is complicated. The number hit the Thompson family like a physical blow. Sarah did rapid mental calculations. Their annual household income was barely $40,000. Even if they sold everything they owned, mortgaged their house to the maximum, and worked multiple jobs for the rest of their lives, they couldn't raise that kind of money. There has to be another way, Bobby said desperately. Payment plans, charity programs, something. Dr. Harrison nodded sympathetically. There are options. Clinical trials sometimes cover costs, but the waiting lists are extensive. There are also charitable foundations, though the application process can take months. Unfortunately, Madison's condition is progressing too rapidly for us to wait for bureaucratic approvals. Madison felt a familiar sensation, the crushing weight of being a burden on people she loved. What happens if we can't afford the treatment? The question hung in the air like a death sentence, Doctor. Harrison's medical training had taught him to remain objective, but 18 years of treating children had made him unable to hide his emotions entirely. We would manage your symptoms as aggressively as possible, maintain your quality of life for as long as we can. How long? Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands trembled. Given the current rate of progression, perhaps 18 months, maybe 2 years, with aggressive symptom management. The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of hospital life, monitors beeping, phones ringing, the everyday sounds of people fighting for their lives. Madison stared at her hands, trying to process the reality that her 16th birthday might be followed by only 1 or 2 more. Bobby stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. There has to be something else, some other treatment, some other option. I wish there were, Dr. Harrison replied honestly. This particular condition is so rare that research funding is limited. The therapy I mentioned represents the cutting edge of treatment options. Sarah found herself thinking about the night Madison had collapsed at school, how small and vulnerable she'd looked in the hospital bed. The maternal instinct that had surprised her 8 years ago when she'd married into instant motherhood now roared to life with ferocious intensity. What if we could raise the money? She asked suddenly. Through fundraising, community support, whatever it takes. How quickly would Madison need to start treatment? Dr. Harrison consulted his notes. Ideally, within the next 6 to 8 weeks. The earlier we begin, the better her chances of complete remission. Madison looked at her family, her father struggling with memories of losing Elizabeth, her stepmother already planning battles she wasn't sure they could win, her grandmother probably worrying about funeral expenses from her small apartment above the garage. The weight of their love felt almost as crushing as the diagnosis itself. I don't want you to destroy yourselves trying to save me, she said quietly. If the money doesn't come together, I want you to know that these 16 years have been enough. I've had a good life because of all of you. Sarah's composure finally cracked. Don't you dare talk like that. Don't you dare give up before we've even started fighting. The drive home took place in heavy silence, each family member processing the magnitude of their situation. Millbrook had never seemed smaller or more isolated than it did during that February afternoon, when the familiar streets and buildings represented not home, but limitation, a place where dreams went to die quietly, without fanfare or hope of resurrection. That evening, the extended Thompson family gathered in the living room for what amounted to a war council. Nana sat in her favorite recliner, her weathered hands folded in her lap as Bobby explained Dr. Harrison's diagnosis and treatment recommendations. The financial reality hit the elderly woman like a physical blow. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. $180,000. That's more money than I've seen in my entire lifetime. Sarah had spent the afternoon researching fundraising options, charity organizations, and clinical trial opportunities. Her laptop screen glowed with dozens of open tabs, potential lifelines that seemed increasingly fragile under closer examination. "The Thompson Community Fundraiser could help," she said, trying to inject optimism into her voice. "Murphy's Diner customers have already started asking about Madison's condition. People want to help." Bobby shook his head grimly. "Sarah, honey, we live in Millbrook, Ohio. Half the town is unemployed or underemployed. They can't afford to donate grocery money to our medical bills no matter how much they want to help. Then we'll expand beyond Millbrook. Social media, regional newspapers, whatever it takes." Sarah's voice carried the determination of someone who'd decided that surrender wasn't an option. People respond to stories like Madison's. A 16-year-old honor student fighting the same disease that killed her mother. That's the kind of story that gets attention. Madison listened to her family planning her salvation with a mixture of gratitude and horror. The idea of becoming a public charity case, of having their private medical and financial struggles exposed for strangers' consumption, made her stomach clench with anxiety. "What if the fundraising doesn't work?" she asked. "What if we only raise half the money or a quarter? Do we spend everything we have chasing something we can't afford?" The question silenced the room because everyone knew it was the most important one they'd face. Bobby had watched Elizabeth slip away while doctors tried increasingly desperate and expensive treatments that ultimately failed. The memory of medical bankruptcy, of choosing between her comfort medications and keeping their house, haunted him still. "We'll face that decision when we come to it," Sarah said finally, "but right now, we focus on giving you every possible chance, because you're worth fighting for." Madison Rose Thompson. "You're worth every risk we might have to take." As the family meeting broke up and everyone retreated to their private worries, Madison remained in the living room staring at the framed photographs that chronicled their family's history. Pictures of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, graduation ceremonies, ordinary moments that had taken on extraordinary significance now that she understood how finite they might be. The weight of her diagnosis settled over the Thompson household like a shroud, transforming every conversation, every shared meal, every casual interaction into something precious and potentially irreplaceable. They had 6 to 8 weeks to raise an impossible amount of money or learn to say goodbye to dreams they'd never imagined losing. The community response began with unexpected generosity, as if Millbrook had been waiting for a cause worthy of its collective heart. Murphy's Diner became the unofficial headquarters for Madison's fundraising campaign, with Sarah's co-workers organizing everything from bake sales to car washes. The diner's bulletin board overflowed with flyers advertising benefit events, and the tip jar labeled Madison's Medical Fund filled and emptied daily as customers contributed whatever spare change they could afford. Jessica Henderson, Madison's closest friend, spearheaded efforts at Millbrook High School. She organized a talent show, a silent auction of donated items, and convinced the football team to host a charity game with neighboring Riverside High. The students' enthusiasm was infectious, spreading through the school like wildfire as teachers, administrators, and even rival sports teams contributed to the cause. Within 3 weeks, the fundraising efforts had raised nearly $15,000, a remarkable achievement for a town where most families lived paycheck to paycheck. Sarah felt simultaneously grateful and heartbroken as she deposited each modest donation, knowing that every dollar represented genuine sacrifice from people who could barely afford their own necessities. But $15,000 against a treatment cost of $180,000 felt like trying to fill an ocean with a teaspoon. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Even if the fundraising continued at its current pace, they would need nearly 2 years to reach their goal. Madison didn't have 2 years. The weight of inadequacy began crushing the family's initial optimism. Bobby picked up additional weekend shifts at a neighboring factory, leaving home before dawn and returning well past midnight. His body, already worn down by 18 years of physical labor, began showing signs of dangerous strain. Sarah noticed him favoring his left shoulder and caught him dry swallowing pain medications when he thought no one was watching. Sarah herself had expanded to working 7 days a week, adding catering jobs and weekend house cleaning services to her regular diner shifts. Her hands, once soft despite years of waitress work, became raw and cracked from constant exposure to cleaning chemicals and dishwater. She lost 12 pounds in 3 weeks, surviving on coffee and the guilt that came with eating when money should be saved for Madison's treatment. The stress began manifesting in unexpected ways throughout the household. Nana Thompson's blood pressure spiked to dangerous levels, requiring a medication adjustment they couldn't afford. Bobby's chronic back pain, manageable for years through over-the-counter remedies, flared into something requiring prescription drugs and physical therapy. Even their 10-year-old Honda began exhibiting mechanical problems, as if the family's desperation had infected their possessions. Madison watched her family destroying themselves in service of her survival and felt a different kind of sickness growing inside her chest. The physical pain from her condition had become manageable through prescription medications, but the emotional agony of witnessing her loved one's sacrifice proved far more devastating than any medical symptom. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late February when Bobby collapsed in the factory parking lot after a 16-hour shift. A coworker found him unconscious beside his car, keys still clutched in his hand, and called an ambulance. Sarah received the call at Murphy's Diner and raced to Millbrook General with flour still coating her apron from the evening's dinner rush. Bobby's collapse resulted from a combination of exhaustion, dehydration, and stress-induced cardiac irregularities. The emergency room doctor, a young resident who looked barely older than Madison, explained that Bobby's body was shutting down from overwork and chronic stress. He prescribed immediate rest, reduced work hours, and follow-up cardiac monitoring, recommendations that sounded like luxuries to a family already drowning in medical expenses. "I can't stop working," Bobby protested weakly from his hospital bed. "Madison needs that treatment money." "Dad, no." Madison's voice carried a firmness that surprised everyone in the room. "I won't let you kill yourself trying to save me. I won't be responsible for destroying this entire family." Sarah felt something break inside her chest as she watched the two people she loved most arguing about who deserved to sacrifice their health for the other's survival. The hospital room, with its sterile white walls and mechanical beeping, felt like a tomb where their family's happiness had come to die. The financial pressures intensified when insurance companies began denying coverage for both Bobby's emergency room visit and Madison's ongoing specialist care. The appeals process required hours of phone calls, mountains of paperwork, and legal expertise they couldn't afford. Sarah found herself navigating bureaucratic mazes that seemed designed to discourage sick people from seeking help. Dr. Harrison called during Bobby's second day in the hospital with news that felt like a final blow. The experimental treatment program had received additional funding, allowing them to accept Madison into a clinical trial that would cover most of the treatment costs. However, the trial required participants to relocate to Columbus for the duration of therapy, 18 months of living expenses in a city where their rural savings would evaporate within weeks. Even with the treatment covered, we're looking at housing, food, transportation, and lost income costs of approximately $60,000, Dr. Harrison explained gently. There are some assistance programs, but the waiting lists are extensive. Sarah thanked Dr. Harrison and hung up the phone, then sat in the hospital corridor and cried for the first time since this nightmare began. The clinical trial represented Madison's best chance at survival, but accepting it would require the family to abandon everything they'd built in Millbrook. Bobby's job, their house, Nana's support system, their entire community network. That evening, the extended Thompson family gathered once again in Bobby's hospital room for what felt like a final decision-making session. The conversation carried the weight of choosing between impossible options, each path leading to different forms of loss and sacrifice. "We take the clinical trial," Bobby announced, his voice hoarse but determined. "We sell the house, liquidate everything, and move to Columbus. Madison's life is worth more than any possessions we might lose." Nana Thompson, looking every one of her 73 years, nodded slowly. "I can sell my jewelry, my mother's china set. It won't be much, but every bit helps." Madison felt the familiar crushing sensation of being loved too much, of inspiring sacrifices too great for any 16-year-old to bear. "You're talking about destroying everything you've worked for. Your jobs, your home, your entire lives." "Honey," Sarah said quietly, "you are our lives. Everything else is just stuff." The words should have been comforting, but Madison felt only the terrible weight of responsibility. How do you accept salvation that costs everyone you love their security, their stability, their future? How do you choose your own survival over your family's well-being? Dr. Harrison had given them 2 weeks to decide about the clinical trial, 2 weeks to choose between Madison's life and the Thompson family's complete financial destruction. 2 weeks to decide whether love was worth bankruptcy, homelessness, and the dissolution of everything they'd built together. As visiting hours ended and the family prepared to leave Bobby overnight for observation, Madison made a decision that felt both necessary and devastating. She would accept the clinical trial and the sacrifices it required, but she would also begin planning for the possibility that the treatment might fail. If she was going to cost her family everything, she needed to ensure that her potential death would leave them with something more than debt and regret. The drive home from the hospital took place through a February snowstorm that seemed to mirror the chaos in their lives. Sarah gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles while Madison stared out at the familiar streets of Millbrook, wondering if she was seeing her hometown for one of the last times. Their house, when they finally reached it, felt different. Smaller somehow, as if the weight of their decision had physically compressed their living space. The framed photographs on the mantel, the worn furniture that held decades of family memories, the kitchen table where they'd shared thousands of meals, everything looked like artifacts from a life they were about to abandon. That night, Madison lay awake, listening to Sarah crying softly in the next room, and made a promise to herself that whatever happened in Columbus, whatever the clinical trial's outcome, she would find a way to give her family back some of what they were sacrificing for her. Even if she didn't survive, she would ensure that their love for her didn't destroy them entirely. The clinical trial represented hope, but it also represented the end of everything they'd known. In 2 weeks, the Thompson family would learn whether love was stronger than money, whether sacrifice could purchase miracles, and whether some prices were simply too high for even the most devoted families to pay. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other, delivered by a postal worker who had no idea he was carrying either salvation or another form of devastation. Sarah found it mixed among the usual bills and advertisements, the return address reading, Richardson, Klein Associates, Attorneys at Law, Columbus, Ohio. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope, expecting another insurance denial or medical bill that would push them deeper into financial ruin. Instead, she found herself staring at legal documents that made no sense in the context of their current crisis. The letter began with formal condolences for Elizabeth Thompson's death. Strange, considering Elizabeth had been gone for over 8 years. As Sarah read further, her legs gave out, forcing her to sit heavily on the kitchen chair where Madison usually did homework. "Mrs. Thompson," the letter continued, "we are writing to inform you that our client, the late Elizabeth Marie Thompson, established a medical trust fund in 2007, 1 year before her death. Per the terms of this trust, funds are to be released only upon diagnosis of the specific genetic condition that claimed Mrs. Thompson's life, and only if said diagnosis occurs in her biological daughter, Madison Rose Thompson." Sarah read the paragraph 3 times before the words began to make sense. Elizabeth had known. Somehow, 8 years before genetic testing could confirm Madison's condition, Elizabeth had known this day would come and had prepared for it. The trust fund contained $247,000, enough to cover Madison's entire treatment program with money left over for living expenses during their stay in Columbus. Elizabeth had liquidated her life insurance policy, sold inherited family jewelry, and even borrowed against her own future to create this safety net for a daughter who was only 8 years old when her mother died. Bobby arrived home from his reduced factory shift to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents and crying so hard she could barely speak. His first assumption was that they'd received more devastating news. Another insurance denial, another impossible medical bill, another barrier between Madison and the treatment she desperately needed. "What now?" he asked wearily, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd absorbed too many catastrophic blows. "What fresh hell are we dealing with today?" Sarah handed him the letter without speaking, watching his face transform as he read. Bobby's expression shifted from resignation to confusion to something approaching shock, his weathered hands shaking as he processed Elizabeth's final gift to their daughter. "She knew," he whispered, his voice breaking entirely. "Dear God, Sarah, she knew this would happen." Madison found them both crying when she returned from school, and her first instinct was panic. After weeks of devastating news and impossible choices, tears in the Thompson household usually meant another crisis, another reason to lose hope. "What's wrong now?" she asked, dropping her backpack by the door and preparing for the latest blow to their family's rapidly disintegrating stability. Bobby held up the legal documents, his hand still trembling. "Your mother left you something, sweetheart. Something we never knew existed." The explanation took nearly an hour, with Madison reading and rereading the trust documents while Bobby and Sarah filled in details about Elizabeth's final year of life. Apparently, Elizabeth had been experiencing symptoms similar to Madison's during her pregnancy and the months following Madison's birth. Without access to modern genetic testing, doctors had been unable to provide a definitive diagnosis, but Elizabeth had researched her condition obsessively. She'd discovered case studies of similar symptoms in medical journals, learned about the hereditary nature of certain autoimmune conditions, and had quietly consulted with specialists who confirmed her worst fears. Her condition was likely genetic, potentially fatal, and could very well affect any children she might have. She spent her last year preparing for this possibility, Bobby explained, his voice thick with emotion. Liquidating assets, setting up the trust, making sure you'd have options she never had. She died knowing you might face the same battle, but she also died knowing you'd have the weapons to fight it. Madison stared at the legal documents, trying to process the magnitude of her mother's sacrifice. Elizabeth had faced her own death while simultaneously planning for her daughter's potential illness, ensuring that love would transcend the grave in the most practical way possible. but the relief was complicated by a revelation that emerged during their meeting with the trust attorney the following day. Elizabeth's final medical records, sealed within the trust documents, revealed details about her death that Bobby had never shared with the family. Elizabeth hadn't died from sudden complications, as Bobby had always claimed. She'd chosen to discontinue her own experimental treatment, redirecting the money meant for her care into Madison's trust fund. She could have lived longer, Dr. Richardson, the family lawyer, explained gently. The treatment available in 2008 wasn't curative, but it could have extended her life by several months, possibly a year. She chose to sacrifice that time to ensure Madison would have better options. The revelation hit the family like a physical blow. Elizabeth hadn't just prepared for Madison's potential illness. She'd actively chosen to die sooner to fund her daughter's survival. The trust money wasn't just a gift. It was purchased with Elizabeth's own life. Madison felt something break inside her chest, a different kind of pain than anything her medical condition had caused. The mother she barely remembered had not only loved her enough to die for her, but had made the conscious choice to purchase Madison's future with her own remaining time. Bobby's guilt was overwhelming. For 8 years, he'd carried the secret of Elizabeth's choice, believing he was protecting Madison from an unbearable truth. Now, faced with his daughter's similar diagnosis, the weight of Elizabeth's sacrifice felt simultaneously like salvation and condemnation. "Why didn't you tell me?" Madison asked her father, her voice carrying more confusion than anger. "Why didn't you tell me she chose to die for me?" Bobby's response came through tears that had been 8 years in the making. "Because I was afraid you'd think you weren't worth it. I was afraid you'd carry the guilt of her choice your entire life." Sarah felt like an outsider watching a family reckon with secrets that predated her marriage to Bobby. Elizabeth's presence in their lives had always been abstract, a beloved memory, a source of comparison, a ghost that Sarah could never quite compete with. Now Elizabeth felt terrifyingly real, her love for Madison manifesting in ways that Sarah's own devotion seemed inadequate to match. The trust fund solved their immediate financial crisis, but it created emotional complications that threatened to tear the family apart in different ways. Madison struggled with survivor's guilt that made her previous medical anxiety seem trivial by comparison. How do you accept a gift that cost your mother her life? How do you choose survival when it was purchased with someone else's death? Bobby wrestled with 8 years of suppressed grief and guilt, finally confronting the reality that he'd been complicit in Elizabeth's sacrifice. He'd known about her choice to discontinue treatment, had even agreed with her decision to prioritize Madison's future, but living with the consequences had proved far more difficult than making the initial choice. Sarah faced the devastating realization that Madison's biological mother had loved her daughter more completely than Sarah had ever imagined possible. Elizabeth's sacrifice made Sarah's own efforts, the extra jobs, the financial stress, the sleepless nights, seem almost insignificant by comparison. The appointment with Dr. Harrison to discuss the clinical trial took on a different character with the trust fund in place. Instead of desperate parents begging for charity, they became a family with options, with the resources to make choices based on medical merit rather than financial desperation. "This changes everything," Dr. Harrison explained, reviewing Madison's case with new optimism. "With proper funding, we can pursue the most aggressive treatment protocol available. Madison's chances of complete remission increase significantly when we're not limited by cost considerations." But Madison found herself questioning whether she deserved treatment that had been purchased with her mother's life. The clinical trial that had seemed like salvation now felt like an obligation she wasn't sure she could bear. How do you fight for survival when someone else died to make that fight possible? The family spent the evening after Dr. Harrison's appointment sitting around their kitchen table, grappling with emotions too complex for easy resolution. The trust fund had removed their financial barriers, but it had erected emotional obstacles that seemed equally challenging to overcome. "Your mother wanted you to live," Bobby said finally, his voice carrying 8 years of pent-up truth. "She researched every option, consulted with specialists, made sure the trust would provide exactly what you'd need. Her sacrifice was meaningless if you don't accept what she's offering." Sarah, who had spent months feeling inadequate as Madison's stepmother, found unexpected strength in Elizabeth's example. "I can't love you the way your biological mother did," she told Madison quietly. "But I can honor her sacrifice by making sure you accept the gift she died to give you." Madison looked at the legal documents spread across their familiar kitchen table, at the faces of the family members who'd fought so hard to save her, at the evidence of a mother's love that had transcended death itself. The trust fund wasn't just money. It was Elizabeth's final argument for Madison's survival, her last act of maternal protection. "I'll do the treatment," Madison announced, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Not because I think I deserve it, but because she believed I did. And maybe that's enough." The decision to accept Elizabeth's gift and pursue aggressive treatment marked a turning point for the Thompson family. They would still face the challenges of relocating to Columbus, of navigating experimental therapy, of rebuilding their lives around Madison's medical needs. But they would face those challenges with resources Elizabeth had provided and with the knowledge that love, even love from beyond the grave, was stronger than any obstacle they might encounter. The trust fund had given them more than money. It had given them proof that Madison's life was worth fighting for, that her survival justified any sacrifice, and that some gifts transcend the boundaries between life and death. 1 year later, Madison Rose Thompson stood in the kitchen of their small Columbus apartment, her auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail that revealed healthy, unmarked skin behind both ears. The experimental treatment had exceeded everyone's expectations, eliminating not just the dangerous swelling, but also the underlying autoimmune condition that had claimed her mother's life. Dr. Harrison called her case a complete clinical success, but Madison knew the real victory was more complicated than medical terminology could capture. The apartment they'd rented near Children's Hospital had become home in ways their Millbrook house never quite managed. Perhaps it was because every piece of furniture, every photograph, every small decoration had been chosen together as a family, united by purpose rather than obligation. Sarah had found work at a Columbus diner that paid better than Murphy's ever had, while Bobby discovered that his factory experience translated surprisingly well to hospital maintenance work. Most remarkably, Nana Thompson had thrived in their new environment. The elderly woman who'd seemed frail and isolated in Millbrook had blossomed in Columbus, volunteering at the hospital's Family Support Center and becoming a surrogate grandmother to dozens of other families navigating medical crises. Her small apartment near theirs buzzed with activity as she coordinated meal trains, support groups, and fundraising efforts for families who couldn't afford what Elizabeth's trust fund had provided. Madison's own transformation went far beyond her physical recovery. The 16-year-old who'd hidden behind her hair for months had evolved into an 18-year-old who spoke confidently at medical conferences, sharing her story with researchers studying rare genetic conditions. Dr. Harrison had invited her to co-author a case study about early intervention in hereditary autoimmune disorders, making her one of the youngest people ever published in the Journal of Genetic Medicine. The college acceptance letter from Ohio State arrived on a Tuesday morning in May, accompanied by a full scholarship funded by the same medical research foundation that had supported her treatment. Madison's dream of studying pre-medicine was no longer financially impossible. It was an inevitability, supported by organizations that recognized her unique perspective as both patient and advocate. Sarah watched her stepdaughter reading the acceptance letter and felt a complex mixture of pride and melancholy. The frightened girl who'd collapsed in chemistry class had become a young woman with purpose, with direction, with a future that stretched beyond mere survival. Yet Sarah sometimes missed the vulnerability that had brought them together, the shared crisis that had forged their mother-daughter bond. "I want to specialize in genetic counseling," Madison announced over dinner that evening, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd found their calling. "Help families understand what they're facing before they have to make the choices we made." Bobby nodded approvingly, though his expression carried traces of the anxiety that had never quite left him since Madison's diagnosis. "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly. "She always believed you'd do something important with your life." The mention of Elizabeth no longer carried the painful weight it once had. Over the past year, the family had learned to speak about her naturally, incorporating her memory into their daily lives rather than treating her as a subject too sacred or too painful for casual conversation. Madison had even begun wearing Elizabeth's wedding ring on a chain around her neck, not as a burden of inherited tragedy, but as a reminder of inherited strength. The success of Madison's treatment had attracted media attention that the family handled with characteristic Midwest pragmatism. A feature story in People magazine brought hundreds of letters from families facing similar medical crises, leading Madison to start a blog called Letters to Tomorrow's Me, where she shared practical advice about navigating complex medical systems, managing family stress, and maintaining hope during seemingly hopeless circumstances. The blog had grown into something approaching a movement, with medical professionals sharing Madison's posts, insurance advocates using her story to argue for expanded coverage of experimental treatments, and families finding community in the comment sections where they shared their own struggles and victories. Dr. Harrison had become more than Madison's physician. He'd become a mentor and collaborator in her advocacy work. Together, they'd testified before state legislators about the need for genetic testing coverage, appeared on medical podcasts discussing patient-centered care, and established a small foundation that provided emergency funding for families facing situations similar to what the Thompsons had endured. The foundation, called Elizabeth's Gift, had already helped 12 families access treatments they couldn't afford, using a combination of Madison's speaking fees, donations inspired by her story, and careful investments of the remaining trust fund money. Each family they helped felt like a validation of Elizabeth's sacrifice, proof that her death had purchased more than just Madison's survival. Sarah's role in the family had evolved from stepmother to equal partner in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. The crisis that had once made her feel like an outsider had ultimately proven her belonging beyond any doubt. Madison's legal adoption of Sarah, a decision Madison had requested for her 18th birthday, had formalized what everyone already knew. Biology was less important than choice in defining family relationships. The ceremony at the Columbus courthouse had been small and private, but emotionally overwhelming for everyone involved. When the judge pronounced Madison Rose Thompson Parker as Sarah's legal daughter, the tears that followed weren't from sadness or loss, but from the recognition that love had triumphed over circumstances that could have destroyed them. Bobby's transformation had been perhaps the most surprising of all. The man who'd spent 8 years avoiding difficult conversations about Elizabeth's death had become the family's emotional anchor, helping Madison process the complicated legacy of her mother's sacrifice while supporting Sarah's integration into their shared history. His factory worker's pragmatism had evolved into something approaching wisdom, earned through the crucible of nearly losing everything that mattered. As Madison prepared for her high school graduation, delayed a year due to her medical treatment but no less meaningful for the wait, the Thompson family reflected on how completely their lives had been transformed. The small-town existence they'd left behind in Millbrook felt like someone else's story, though they maintained connections to friends who'd supported them during their darkest months. The graduation ceremony itself took place in a Columbus auditorium filled with families celebrating academic achievements. But Madison's presence drew special attention from classmates and teachers who knew her story. Her valedictorian speech, titled "The Price of Tomorrow," brought the entire audience to their feet as she spoke about inherited courage, chosen families, and the responsibility that comes with survival. "My mother died to give me choices she never had," Madison told the assembled graduates and their families. "But the greatest gift she gave me wasn't money or medical treatment. It was the understanding that love is an action, not just a feeling. Every day we choose to love someone is a day we invest in their tomorrow, even if we're not guaranteed to be there to see it." The speech captured something essential about the Thompson family's journey, distilling 18 months of crisis and transformation into a message that resonated far beyond their personal experience. Local news stations picked up excerpts, and the video eventually found its way to social media platforms where it was shared thousands of times by people who recognized universal truths in Madison's specific story. As the graduation ceremony concluded and the Thompson family gathered for photographs, they represented something that would have seemed impossible during Madison's darkest days. A family not just surviving but thriving, having discovered that the bonds forged in crisis could become stronger than those created in comfort. The future stretched ahead of them with possibilities that Elizabeth's sacrifice had made real, and each day forward was both a celebration of Madison's survival and a testament to the enduring power of a mother's love to transcend the boundaries between life and death. Dear friends, Madison's story reminds us that the deepest love often manifests in quiet sacrifices we make today, for tomorrows we may never see. Elizabeth Thompson knew she might not live to watch her daughter graduate, marry, or become the doctor she dreamed of being. Yet she chose to invest her final months ensuring Madison would have those opportunities. How many of us have made similar choices, perhaps without realizing their profound impact? As grandparents, parents, and mentors, we plant seeds in gardens we may never fully enjoy, believing in futures our love helps create. Sarah's journey shows us that family isn't always born. Sometimes it's chosen, nurtured through crisis, and strengthened by shared commitment to something greater than ourselves. The Thompson family's transformation from near destruction to triumph speaks to the resilience that defines our generation. People who understand that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the legacy of love we leave behind. Madison's survival and success became Elizabeth's greatest victory, proving that a mother's love transcends even death itself. Sometimes our most important gifts aren't the ones we give in life, but the ones we arrange to give after we're gone. Questions for reflection. What quiet sacrifices have you made that your loved ones may not fully understand until years later? How have you seen chosen family bonds prove stronger than blood relationships in your own life? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories of sacrifice and love inspire us all.